the sirens, a soft static that turned the city into a blurred watercolor. And in that smear of red taillights and wet glass, Myra pressed her palm to the neonatal ICU window and promised her son that she would never leave him, not even if the world tried to take her apart. She was 27, sleep-starved, and not built for quiet rooms. But the NICU demanded a different kind of strength. The kind that sits, breathes, and keeps breathing when monitors stutter and tubes look like fragile veins for machines. The title of her life, the promise we couldn't outrun, should have felt melodramatic. But as thunder stitched the distance, and her reflection shook inside that glass, it felt like prophecy. A hook lodged behind her ribs, pulling her forward into a night with no edges. Myra wanted a thing so simple, it almost felt indecent to say aloud. She wanted her son, Eli, to live, to breathe without plastic, to curve his hand around her finger, and sleep warm against her chest in a world that would soften when he cried. The obstacles were unglamorous and absolute. Lungs born too early, oxygen saturation numbers that dipped like birds, a heart that stuttered, and a hospital bill tallying into a future she couldn't afford. Even if she mortgaged every piece of her pride, she had grown up sprinting out of arguments, out of apartments with eviction notices, out of jobs that took more than they gave. But nothing in her life could be outrun now. Everything required staying. The first monitor alarm that night was not a scream, but a cough of sound, quick enough to be mistake. And yet her body cataloged it with animal precision, turning her eyes to the numbers. 86, 82, 77. The room filled with the controlled urgency of nurses who had performed this choreography too many times. Hands moving with grace, voices calm enough to anchor a storm. Myra watched the way they touched him, like he was both porcelain and wildfire, delicate and dangerous. And something inside her recalibrated from panic to prayer that wasn't religious so much as desperate. A plea thrown against the walls of this sterile universe. Breathe for him, Nurse Hannah said gently, her voice like a bridge over dark water. And Myra tried, inhaling for 4 counts, exhaling for 6, following a rhythm she could control, while the one that mattered danced away from her. She thought of Eli's father, Jonah, who had left 3 months into the pregnancy, slipping out with a note that said he wasn't built for this much gravity. Like love was a planet pulling him apart. She hated him a little for the quiet in that sentence, the way it yielded instead of breaking, and hated herself more for how part of her still wanted to call. The monitor steadied. 89, 91, 93. Relief came like warm floodwaters, soft and dangerous, because it promised she could stand, if only she didn't look at the ruin beneath the surface. Hannah squeezed her shoulder, and it felt like someone had reminded her that her body still lived here, that she had not dissolved entirely into fear. They let her touch him with a gloved finger through the port. His skin was soft as breath, his hand no bigger than a moth. She imagined light moving through him like a tide, counted heartbeats against the pad of her finger, and made her promise again. Quieter this time, because quiet makes vows heavier. I will not leave you. The vow anchored her to the floor, and for a few minutes she could stand still inside her own life. Outside, the rain hardened. The storm took the power on their block, but the hospital hummed on its generators. That faithful undercurrent, like a giant's purr. In the waiting room, a vending machine clicked to life, and back to death, and back to life. A tiny resurrection repeated, until it felt like a joke. The building was telling itself to stay brave. Myra's phone buzzed with a text from her sister. "Lena, you eating?" And she texted back a lie. Totally. Hospital grilled cheese, gourmet. She stepped into the hallway for coffee and nearly collided with a man in a soaked jacket, carrying a bundle of flowers not meant for a neonatal ward. He steadied the bouquet with the same care one reserves for glass, muttered an apology, and Myra realized that even in sanctuaries, people carried their ordinary miracles and griefs side by side. For an instant, she envied him. His problem had a shape she could see and wasn't hooked to a machine. When she returned to the glass, a doctor was already there, Dr. Patel, shoes squeaking from the rain he had run through, eyes soft with the terrible eloquence of someone practiced at balancing hope and math. "He's a fighter," he said, and she forced herself not to ask how many fighters he had buried. He explained about steroids and surfactant therapy, and the next 48 hours, a cliff-edge time frame Myra understood intuitively, as if some ancient part of her could read tides and predict what drowned and what swam. Inside her, something unclenched, and something else caught fire. She had always been better at movement than waiting, so she made a plan, even if it was a fiction to keep the wolves at the edge of the clearing. She would pick up shifts at the diner, sleep in the chair, sell the ring her grandmother left, call the landlord, say the word extension like it was a prayer. She would not think about Jonah, not think about the night he had left like smoke, not think about how abandonment arranges itself inside a body like furniture that keeps getting shuffled but never removed. At midnight, the elevator dinged, and a gurney rolled off with a patient draped in a blue blanket. The shape underneath, both anonymous and unbearably specific. Myra caught a glimpse of a hand, a wrist tattoo, a small wave line, and thought, unreasonably, of Jonah, of the way he had drawn seagulls on napkins. Every bird a parabola of escape. The door closed, a final punctuation mark on a sentence she didn't know, and she returned to Eli, to the numbers holding steady like a fragile truce. When she finally slept, chin on her chest, she dreamed of running on a beach as dawn undid the night. In the dream, she carried Eli pressed to her ribs, and the tide chased them, both like a game they couldn't lose. She woke to another alarm, sharper this time, and the open loop of the night widened into something that felt like a mouth. She stood, and everything in her wanted to run, but she stayed, because sometimes the bravest act is to plant your feet where the fear is and keep breathing until the dawn chooses you. At 5:12 a.m., the storm passed without apology, and the sky turned the color of exhausted peaches, thin light filtering through the blinds like ribs. The NICU had its own dawn rituals, shift-change murmurs, pages flipping on clipboards, the crinkle of gowns, the way the coffee tasted like a dare. Myra's neck was stiff from sleeping at an angle the human body wasn't designed to hold, and the first flex of her fingers felt like unfreezing. Dr. Patel arrived with a small platoon residents, a respiratory therapist, a nurse practitioner who walked like certainty. They spoke in a measured cadence that made crisis sound like math. Gases, pressure, feed tolerance, the ongoing negotiation with a stubborn pair of lungs. Myra listened for verbs, because verbs meant action, and action meant there was still a bridge from here to later. Eli's oxygen needs had bumped up overnight. The vent settings had been adjusted, and they wanted to try gentle care, more skin to skin when he tolerated it. The phrase, "when he tolerates," made Myra's chest ache, as if her son were already learning how to carry discomfort like a bag he didn't pack. She nodded, because nodding looked like competence, and competence was its own kind of charm against the chaos snakes coiling at the base of her skull. Lena arrived with a tote bag heavy enough to have its own gravitational field, socks, a second sweater, granola bars, a hand cream that smelled like lemon, and a Tupperware of arroz con pollo their mother used to make. "Food is non-negotiable," she said, dropping it into Myra's lap with sisterly authority, and the smell alone made Myra feel 6 years old and safe for 3 seconds. Lena's eyes, however, did the inventory that only sisters can perform skin tone tremor. The way Myra chewed the inside of her cheek until it reddened. "Have you called him?" Lena asked softly, and the pronoun didn't need a noun. "No," Myra said then, "I won't," because saying it twice felt like building a fence. Lena didn't push. Instead, she folded a blanket with the care of someone smoothing a wound. Money, that other monitor, beeped in Myra's head in a rhythm that clashed with Eli's. She had 3 shifts this week if she wanted them. Mrs. Donnelly at the diner had texted hearts, and then numbers, an arithmetic of survival. The landlord had left a voicemail that began nicely enough and ended with the quiet steel of consequence. "Let me help," Lena said, and Myra flinched, because help felt like a mirror that reflected the parts of her she least wanted to see. "I've got it," she lied again, and the lie didn't even blush. Pride sat in her throat like a stone she couldn't swallow and couldn't spit out. They let her do kangaroo care mid-morning. Hannah showed her how to hold the tubes with both reverence and casualness, the way one might cradle a cloud. Eli's body against her chest was shockingly warm, a sun not bigger than a squirrel pressing light into her sternum. She felt his breaths, those little bird wings, and counted. And in counting, she believed in a future where numbers became birthdays. Across the room, a couple laughed too loudly. The sound jagged with fear, and Myra loved them instantly for how they defied the room's command to be small. She closed her eyes and pressed her mouth to Eli's hat and told him a story about a place where waves spoke in full sentences and seagulls were terrible at keeping secrets. If voice could build lungs, hers would. At noon, Jonah texted, the name Jonah in all caps from years ago when that looked like devotion. Instead of alarm, lit the screen with a simple line. Heard from Lena. How is he? Can I come? The world dropped an inch, and Myra steadied it with her hand on the bassinet, as if the earth were a table, and she could keep the drinks from spilling with a palm. Her first response was a storm surge no, followed by its undertow. A hunger she didn't trust. She pictured his mouth forming the word sorry, and hated how that word could still oxygenate parts of her heart. She typed, deleted, typed, deleted, then decided on a compromise that felt like a bruise. Visiting hours end at 8. If you come for him. Lena watched the choreography with her eyebrows. I don't want him to hurt you again, she said. And Myra said, me neither. And lately, the phrase we was a thing she only used with her sister and her son, as if everyone else were a tide that had failed her. She didn't say the other truth, the unpretty one. That sometimes hurt was how she measured what had mattered. Eli's numbers dipped and rose, a C graph on a screen. A code was called 2 rooms over code pink, the syllables brittle as dropped glass, and time performed its cruel trick of stretching and compressing at once. In the corridor, a nurse cried soundlessly, and then wiped her face, pulled her mask back up, and returned to the room like a soldier walking back into smoke. The afternoon turned lavender, then gray, then the particular blue of hospitals that have forgotten what day it is. Jonah texted again. I'm downstairs. Her body knew before her mind did. Her heart performed that ancient theater of hope and dread where the curtain never fully rises. He walked in shorn of his usual Boy Scout handsomeness. He looked older by a decade, and as if his bones had been hollowed out by regret and refilled with river water. He set a paper bag on the chair, food, real food, and Myra wanted to both hug him and throw the bag at the wall. I'm here for him, he said, meeting the condition as if it were a password. They stood at the glass together, 2 people who had once believed they could make a family out of borrowed furniture and shared playlists. He's beautiful, Jonah said, and the word beautiful landed inside Myra like a flare. He cried, which was both too much and exactly enough. Eli's oxygen dipped again, and both of them reached for the glass with the same useless instinct. Hands mirrored like a photograph captioned, parents. Myra felt something uncoil anger, or maybe the need to be the only one who loved enough to hurt, because sharing was a form of surrender. Hannah adjusted a line, and the numbers crept back up, 90, 92, and the room exhaled. Let me help, Jonah said, the echo of Lena's earlier plea, and Myra thought of fences again, of gates. "You can sit," she said, "and you can be quiet." And the conditions tasted like a peace treaty negotiated by the wounded. He obeyed, and for a while the only noise was the hum of machines and the soft arithmetic of hope. Evening pulled the building taut. Every sound felt amplified, like the hospital had become a radio, tuned slightly off station. Jonah left at 7:59, exactly on the edge of permission, and at the door he turned, mouth parting around words she didn't want. "Tomorrow," he said instead. Choosing the smallest future they could bear, Myra returned to Eli and rested her forehead against the glass until the cold soothed the hot place in her thoughts. She was very tired of being brave, but bravery, it turned out, did not require consent. It simply kept showing up like weather. She folded into the chair, and before sleep took her, she imagined a shoreline where a promise could be set down and still remain true. On the third day, the bill arrived like an extraneous wound. Itemized care turned into a column of numbers that could have been coordinates to a distant planet she'd never reach. She skimmed until her eyes snagged on a total that made her mouth go dry, then folded the paper into a small square, as if shrinking it would alter the sum. In her pocket, the paper grew heavy, a mineral. Myra took the lunch shift at Donnelly's, tied on a clean apron, and stepped into the other life she still owed. The hiss of a flat top, the ballet of plates, the sharp gossip of cooks who built their days out of heat and jokes. Regulars asked about the baby with a gravity that both comforted and scraped. She offered the same curated paragraph of facts, a press release designed to prevent collapse. Tips were decent, hope-minted coins that clinked like maybe after she went to the pawn shop with her grandmother's ring in a velvet pouch, the kind of pouch that made jewelry feel like a secret. The pawnbroker, an older woman with wrists like ropes, examined the ring with a tenderness that undid Myra's throat. "It's a good piece," the woman said, not unkindly, and quoted a number that made practicality wrestle sentiment and win in a grim decision by points. She kept the pouch, empty now, as if absence could be carried with dignity. On the street, she texted Jonah. Insurance called. "Can you handle the appeal?" He replied yes in less than a minute, and the quickness of it rearranged her anger into something like relief she refused to name. At the hospital, Eli had stabilized enough to reduce a setting. He looked more like a person and less like a fragile machine project. And Myra let herself imagine the weight of him on her hip, like a punctuation mark to sentences she hadn't dared to write. Dr. Patel spoke of days, not hours, and the word days felt like winning a small island. Jonah arrived with copies of forms and a face that had learned how to be useful. They began to talk logistics with the same awkward intimacy of people, remembering how to dance after a long winter. Who would sleep where? How shifts could be traded. What to do if the diner called, and the hospital called, and the landlord called in the same hour. They wrote on a whiteboard in the waiting room like students, mapping a theorem, whose proof they didn't believe in, but were committed to attempt. Lena watched without commentary, her silence elaborate. When Myra caught her eye, Lena lifted her chin a fraction, as if to say, choose the gentlest possible version of the truth and survive it. For the first time, Myra allowed a tiny thought to surface, like a cautious fish. Perhaps the promise, "we will not leave," could be plural. That evening, a new nurse, Mateo, took over Eli's care. He had a patient humor that made time behave, and he taught Myra a trick: how to hum through her teeth, so the sound vibrated against Eli's body when she held him. The hum felt like a tether, a low, steady bridge across fear. She used it until her jaw ached, and then used it more. At 9, the elevator opened, and an older couple stepped out holding hands, their faces stunned with fresh grief. Moving through the hall as if gravity had doubled, Mateo met them, and Myra caught the words "I'm sorry" and nothing else. She looked at Jonah and saw him flinch as if he'd been struck. The hospital was a chorus of parallel stories, some ending in lullabies, some in silence, and the knowledge braided her resolve and her fear into a rope she wrapped around her wrist. Back at the apartment, the ceiling leaked into a bowl in the kitchen, every drop a metronome for dread. Myra slept in jeans in case the phone rang. When it did at 2:17 a.m., she was already standing. Eli's numbers had fallen. They were adjusting care. Could she come? She ran. The city at that hour belonged to ambulances and foxes. She caught a bus that smelled like raincoats and strangers' breath, and prayed to the god of green lights. At the hospital, the hallway felt longer, a tunnel built to test resolve. In the room, the choreography was less calm, the air crowded with interventions. Dr. Patel met her eyes and didn't look away, and in that steadying, there was a mercy. "He needs time," he said, "and we're going to give it to him," Myra sang, her voice cracking. A lullaby her mother had sung on nights when their father forgot to be kind. The song turned the sterile space into a small human shelter, and for a beat, the numbers held. Then they fell again. She thought of the title of her life and wanted to argue with it, to rename the story while it was still being written, the promise we outran, maybe, or the night that chose us. But promises, like rivers, have their own ideas about where to bend. At 3:04 a.m., a new medication hung like a tiny moon, and the room waited to see if it would grant any wishes. The days stacked like plates, careful, precarious, occasionally crashing. And in their carefulness, a strange new normal formed, fragile as spun sugar. Myra learned to read Eli's face under the tape, learned the difference between restless and in pain, learned the specific sigh he made when touched with a warm hand. She slept in 90-minute increments and dreamed in alarms. Jonah showed up every day at 4 with paperwork and silence. His steadiness made Myra angry in ways that felt adolescent and justified, and also like a luxury she couldn't afford. He told her he'd picked up shifts loading at the docks. His palms grew new calluses that he seemed embarrassed by, as if evidence of effort were a confession. He didn't ask to be forgiven, which was the smartest thing he'd ever done. One afternoon, Lena brought their mother, who wore grief like a too heavy coat, but still managed to find a way to make the room warmer just by existing. She touched the glass and whispered a prayer in Spanish, the same rhythm she'd used to bless backpacks and band-aids. Myra rested her head on her mother's shoulder and let herself be the child of someone for 10 minutes. Insurance appealed, denied, appealed again. Jonah stayed on hold for hours, the Muzak digging trenches into his brain, when a sympathetic case manager finally moved a piece on the board. It felt like magic, but really it was persistence, the slow violence of refusing to be moved. They won a small concession, a reduction that made survival feel mathematically possible. Eli's lungs, those stubborn knots of air, began to loosen. The day they tried him on room air for 30 seconds, Myra cried in a way that didn't scare anyone, soft and leaking, like a roof finally mended. The hum through her teeth turned into an actual song. But the story's open loops did not close. If anything, they multiplied like stars. Once the eyes adjusted to night, Dr. Patel spoke of the risk of infection, of the way progress could turn and bite if someone forgot humility. The obstacle was not a villain to defeat, but a landscape to cross, full of hidden swamps. On a Friday evening, a security guard asked Myra to step into the hallway, and the request sounded innocuous enough to terrify her. She found a woman there, with hair too clean to belong to anyone living out of a hospital chair, holding a clipboard and a smile that made Myra's molars hurt. "I'm with billing," the woman said, and the words felt like a storm cloud rolling down the corridor. The conversation was gentle and predatory at once, an art form that turned mercy into math. Myra stayed polite until the woman referred to Eli as a unit, and then the heat in her face rose so quickly she had to look away. "He's a person," Myra said evenly, "and his name is Eli." When the woman left, Jonah leaned against the wall and slid to the floor, palms over his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said finally, and the words felt less like a plea and more like a report from the front line. "I was scared. I ran. I'm trying not to run." Myra sank down beside him, both of them small in the long fluorescent river of the hall. "I made a promise," she said, "and I don't know how to carry it and not drown." He nodded, as if she'd just named the shape of the world. They sat like that for a while, two people not fixed, not broken, suspended over a life that might still love them if they did the work. A code was called again somewhere else, the sound thin and terrible. They stood and went back to their son like pilgrims returning to a single candle in a cathedral of storm. Open loops remained, a shadow in Eli's next scan, a cough that lingered, a letter from the landlord evolving from polite to legal. tension tightened, compelling forward motion because stillness now felt like sinking. The story had promised a promise that might not be outrun. The promise kept stretching, and so did they. The week everything tilted began with a laugh. Eli, off the vent for an hour, made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cough, and everyone in the room went still, as if a sacred animal had peered from the brush. Myra pressed her lips to his temple and felt the soft vibration of life, choosing them in small, practical ways. Dr. Patel began using the phrase transition plan, which sounded like the name of a bridge. It included equipment, home visits, classes on how to be brave with a portable monitor. Myra took notes like a good student and tried not to think about how many bridges in her childhood had washed out. Then the cough came back. Not cute this time. A hiccup that escalated into a fight. An infection slipped in through some ordinary door, and by midnight the numbers were writing a bad story. Antibiotics hung, new ones, stronger ones. The room smelled like metal and resolve. Myra did not leave his side. She ate crackers like penance and slept in 5-minute prayers. Jonah argued with an on-call doctor in a way that made sense and ended with an apology. He had learned that fury built bridges only if it knew how to soften its hands. The infection did what infections do. It tested what they were made of. At 3:33 a.m., the monitors roared. The team moved like water, and in their movement, Myra saw a choreography she would never forget. A hand on a bag, a voice counting, a syringe, a click, a stillness, and then, like a door cracking, a number climbing. Eli's chest rose with the help of machines, and the room stopped tasting like goodbyes. After, in the hallway, Myra collapsed into Lena's arms and said, "I can't," meaning 100 things, and also one. I can't live in a story that keeps threatening to end. You can, Lena said, and somehow it didn't sound cruel. It sounded like a weather report. Stormy, then clearing, then stormy again. They waited through 2 more nights, and then the lab work softened. The infection began to retreat, leaving behind a tired boy with a fighter's frown. Dr. Patel smiled in the way doctors do when they've been to the edge, and returned with everyone intact. "He keeps choosing us," he said, and Myra touched the glass with 3 fingers, a benediction and a truce. The discharge day was embarrassing in its normalcy. There were forms, always forms, and a class about car seats that made Myra laugh in a register she barely remembered owning. The nurse showed her how to coil monitor wires so they didn't catch on door handles, a domestic art she hoped to forget soon. Outside, the city had decided to be kind. Sun plain as bread, a breeze that felt like permission. They strapped Eli into the seat, and he narrowed his eyes at the light, like an old man reconsidering an opinion. Jonah carried the bags and did not attempt to narrate the moment into redemption. He had learned that some forgiveness arrives sideways if it arrives at all. At home, the leak had been fixed by a neighbor who owed Lena a favor. The bowl sat empty on the counter, like a relic from a previous life. They set Eli's bassinet by the window, where the plant had finally forgiven Myra for forgetting it for 3 weeks, and put out 2 new leaves as if to say, "See, resilience is a species." That night, they took turns sleeping, and not sleeping because sleeping felt like arrogance. At 2 in the morning, a storm walked back across the sky as if it had forgotten its keys. Eli fussed, then settled, and Myra sat on the floor with her back to the bed and let the thunder count seconds for her. Jonah sat across from her, legs long, hands open, as if he were practicing not holding on too tight. "I kept thinking the story was the hospital," he said quietly. "But of course it's this room, these hours. The way the promise is going to be 1,000 small choices." Myra nodded, throat thick. "I'm not asking you to forget," he added, "just to let me carry some of it." She looked at Eli, his mouth doing that newborn goldfish thing, and felt the love that had nearly ruined her turn into the kind that builds. "Okay," she said, a small word, a new country. The rain softened like applause far away. Weeks later, the monitor came off, an emancipation as quiet as a click. They took Eli to the park, and he stared at leaves like they were a thesis on light. Myra pushed the stroller over a crack in the path and felt the old urge to run flare, and then go out like a match in wind. The story resolved not with trumpets, but with continuance, checkups that ended in stickers, a landlord who accepted a payment plan with a human shrug, a diner regular who pressed an envelope into Myra's palm without looking at her eyes. She and Jonah learned the choreography of co-parenting without the lie of romance, a dance that valued steadiness over sparkle. Some nights, the open loops still woke her, what-ifs fluttering like bats. But she knew the way back to sleep now, a hum in her teeth, a hand on her son's chest, the quiet conviction that the promise had not outrun them after all. They went to the beach on a day that looked borrowed from a catalog. Eli laughed at the gulls, terrible secret keepers still, and Myra waded ankle-deep into the water and looked out at the horizon like a sentence that didn't need finishing. She remembered the first night's vow and understood it differently now, not a cage, but a compass. When they left, Eli slept with his mouth open, and a grain of sand stuck to his cheek like a small, brave star. In the rear view, Myra watched the road unspool and felt the strange, ordinary ecstasy of having survived the part of the story designed to break her. She reached back, touched his foot, and whispered, "We're here," which was, finally, the only ending she trusted. The only ending she trusted.